Lamentations. We're going to be beginning a study of that book today. In my Bible, it's on page 1118. So, but I do try to keep up with my Old Testament studies, and I just thought this was a good time to look into a new book of the Old Testament since we have finished Hosea. But that being said, today and over the course of the next few months, we're going to be studying this book that is sometimes overlooked in a study of God's Word. But it's a short book, consists of only 5 chapters, but it is still a rich book. There's good information to be gleaned from this book. But my father-in-law was asking me about what we were going to be studying today, and obviously I said Lamentations, but one thing I told him was that today we're just going to kind of introduce the book. We're not going to spend a lot of time in the text. We'll spend some time in the text, but not a lot. So in other words, we're going to be looking at some background information. I think the first thing we need to know as to the background of this book is the question, why is it titled the way that it is I think the first question we need to ask. So the book is obviously called Lamentations. What comes to your mind when you hear that word, Lamentations?
Well, it's not good.
Lament. Okay.
A sorrow, that kind of thing. I mean, that general theme.
Right. So that is kind of the theme of this book. It's a lament, sorrow. But one reason it's titled in the way that it is because of how this book begins. There in the very beginning of verse 1 of chapter 1, we find the word how. We run into that word again in verse 1 of chapter 2, and then also again in verse 1 of chapter 4. Now, that word how, it comes from a Hebrew term that was common for the opening word of statements of mourning. So that being said, another reason this book is titled as Lamentations is because ancient rabbis sometimes refer to the text of this book as what's called dirges. You might be familiar with that word, but dirges is another word for Lamentations. And since these things are true, what we should also understand is that because the reason those things are true is because the text of Lamentations does consist of statements of mourning. It's not a happy book. I will tell you that right off the book. It is not a happy book, and that's one reason it's titled the way that it is. Any questions on that before we keep moving forward? Go ahead. Yeah. Right.
It's really torturous thing, but yet I know when we did Job, you did a great job of pulling out some of the positive, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, we are going to try to find some positive things in this book, but it's not a happy book overall. Anything else before we keep moving forward? All right. So going on with some background details, another important one, not only with this book, but any book of the Bible, we need to take time to look at the author. Now, as far as the author is concerned, tradition has it that Jeremiah, not this Jeremiah, but the Old Testament Jeremiah, of course, is the author of Lamentations. Of course, as I said, that's how tradition has it. Now, one reason it's believed that Jeremiah is the author is because the majority of ancient Jews believed Jeremiah to be the author, as well as the ancient church historians, collectively known as the church fathers, believed this book to be by Jeremiah. But even though that's the case, we do not know with 100% certainty that Jeremiah is the author of this book. And one reason for that is because we don't find his name anywhere in Lamentations. Since that's true, on the other side of the coin, some have suggested that the author of this book could be someone other than Jeremiah. And one reason some say that is because the style and writing of words in Lamentations is different than we find in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah. But that argument has been refuted by the fact that since Lamentations is of a different theme than Jeremiah, it follows that the style and choice of words would also be different. With all that being true, the general consensus is that the author of Lamentations is genuinely the same Jeremiah from whom the book of Jeremiah gets its name. And this is why the book of Lamentations has sometimes been referred to more broadly as the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Questions or comments on the author? All right. Going on, the next important background detail we have to keep in mind, I think, is the date. In other words, we're asking the question when it was written. Now, as far as the date of writing, the general belief about the date of writing is that it was written sometime after 587 BC. Now, one reason that's believed to be true is because it was around that time that the city of Jerusalem was first destroyed by the Babylonians, and that's based on archaeological evidence. Now, with that in mind, what we should also understand about Lamentations is that it is, as I've already said, a book that consists of statements of mourning, but more specifically, it's statements of mourning over the city of Jerusalem and its destruction, because in the text of this book, a lot of the details about the destruction of Jerusalem are written in vivid detail, and it's almost as if Jeremiah saw it for himself. This destruction of 587 happen. Questions or comments on the date? Okay, for those of you who just walked in, we're in Lamentations. But going on with the background details, given the date, we also have to consider the historical context of this book. Now again, I mentioned that the most probable writing of this book was shortly after the 587 destruction of Jerusalem. Now one reason we can assume this is because even though Jerusalem had been previously invaded, we read about that in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But by 587, Jerusalem had never before been as completely destroyed as it was by the Babylonians in 587. Now with that in mind, what we should also know is that the 587 BC destruction, all of Jerusalem's wealth was taken, the city was taken, the temple was destroyed, and many of its people were killed, enslaved, sent off into exile, or its people altogether fled the city. Some of them went back to Egypt. We saw that in Hosea, that some people would go back to Egypt once God's judgment would be carried out. But that destruction, in addition to all that, it happened following a failed attempt by King Zedekiah to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. And we read about that in Jeremiah chapter 39, and then again in Jeremiah chapter 52. Now, since these things are true, this should help us to understand that the text of Lamentations has some overlap with the book of Kings and the book of Jeremiah, and that's why I gave you guys the handout that I did, which I will give to Matt and Dina. I would give this out before class. Yeah. Sorry. But that handout that I gave you shows the overlap with Lamentations with these other books of the Old Testament. Any questions on the historical context? All right. Well, that's enough about the background details. We're now going to get into the text itself. What we're going to do today with the text is gain some more insight as to what this book is about. That's something else we have to ask. What is this book about? And that's where we're going to go to the text. We're going to explore and examine briefly some verses from the opening chapters of this book. It's not going to be the verse by verse. We're just going to look at 3 different passages and consider for ourselves 3 points about what Lamentations is about. From verse 1 of chapter 1, we'll see that Lamentations is a book about the fall of Jerusalem. from verse 12, from verse 12 of chapter 1, we'll see that Lamentations is a book about Jeremiah's personal pain over what happened with Jerusalem. And finally, from verse 1 of chapter 2, we'll see that Lamentations is a book about God's anger with Jerusalem. Now, after looking at these things, then, the point we'll be left with is that Lamentations is a book about Jerusalem and that it's a book that deserves our study. So with that in mind, we'll just start off with verse 1 of chapter 1. Again, we're taking it by itself, and then we'll look at that first point. So Lamentations 1, verse 1 says, "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. She has become like a widow who was once great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a forced laborer." So we'll stop with that. So this opening statement of chapter 1, it's a statement about Jerusalem. But what are we told about Jerusalem here in verse 1 of chapter 1? Okay, it's empty. How do we know that? Right, it's been a city full of people, and now the text says, at least in the American Standard, it's lonely. Now, do you have deserted? Okay. So that's not a bad word for it either. So what does that mean when something is lonely, deserted? There's nobody left. Now I want to put this in our minds a little bit more. I think all of us in here have been to Salt Lake City at one point in our lives, if not more. Now, Salt Lake City is a big city. You go there, there's traffic, there's all kinds of people. But now imagine getting up there, and all you see is the buildings. Maybe not even the buildings. It's been completely destroyed. That's Jerusalem. Jerusalem was, and still is, from when Desiree and I went there, is a city full of people. But at this point in history, it was no longer true. The city had been destroyed. I mentioned the temple. Even the temple itself had been destroyed. Nobody there. So Jeremiah, we're operating under that assumption that he's the author. Jeremiah says it's lonely. It's deserted. But he doesn't stop there. He illustrates this point by comparing it to what? Or who? A widow. Now, what do we know about widows? So if they had no sons, they were in deep distress. That's definitely true in this point in time. What else do we know about widows? Not necessarily in the biblical context, but generally speaking. They're nothing, especially in the historical context here. They're alone. Right. That's true. Absolutely. So that's what historically, and in the historical context, that's what was true about widows in the Bible. They had nothing. There was none of these programs to help. There was no Social Security. Let's put it that way. So that's what Jerusalem looked like. This widow had nothing because of the extent of the destruction that had occurred. But this image of widows in situations like that, it's used over and over. We see it in Isaiah, we see it in other Old Testament passages that illustrate this idea of loss. But yes, a widow not only had no husband, as was pointed out, she also had no children. So Jerusalem is being pictured as having lost its husband and its children, meaning its people had been driven out of the city, and they lost everything. But Jeremiah uses another illustration, that of a princess. And what do we think of when we think of a princess? Royalty, riches. But according to the text, what has this princess become? A slave. New American Standard uses the phrase forced laborer, but yes, a slave is a better translation because that's the Hebrew term being used here. So gone from royalty to slavery. Now, for those of you who like country music, this is just coming to my mind right now. But there's a Joey and Rory song that talks about going from fame to fortune, rags to riches, then back to rags. That's the picture being drawn here. Wealthy, back to rags, in this position of slavery. But this is about Jerusalem. So this opening verse tells us that Lamentations has something to do with the fall of Jerusalem. Before I wrap up that point, any questions or comments on verse 1? Yeah. Right. Well, completely wiped out. Yeah. Exactly. Right. Exactly. Using the New Testament language, he wanted them to be the light of the world. Still true of his people today, us. But yeah, I mean, we even saw in Hosea that it wasn't about Jerusalem, it was more about the northern kingdom of Israel, but they would fall into this position of shame after having been, as was put, the unique world power. Anything else on verse 1? Mm-hmm. Mesa Verde, yeah. Exactly. So all the people are gone. And as far as we can tell from what Lamentation says, the city's pretty much in ruins. So, and yes, in our country alone, in our area, in the Four Corners, there's examples of that as well, Mesa Verde being one of them. So, this book is about the fall of Jerusalem, among other things. In this opening verse, Jeremiah's painted that picture that Jerusalem has fallen. It was a very heavily populated city, like Salt Lake. But now it's this lonely city. It's gone from a great city to being a widowed city. It's fallen from being a royal city to being a city in slavery. So that brings us to the next point about what Lamentations is about. We're going to jump down to verse 12. And we're going to look at the point that Lamentations is a book about Jeremiah's personal pain over Jerusalem. If I could ask somebody to read verse 12, that way get some more participation in here. Thank you, Dean. So again, we're looking at the point that Lamentations is a book about Jeremiah's personal pain over the destruction of Jerusalem. But this verse starts off with a question. What's the question here? Right. And what kind of question is that? It's a rhetorical question. And people are passing by. So it's a question that has the idea, do you even care? Now again, I'm using Salt Lake City as my example. Still with that scene, Salt Lake City has been completely abandoned, its buildings destroyed. might be asking, do you care that this even happened? You're driving down the highway, you see Salt Lake City in ruins. Do you even care? But Jeremiah is not only looking at Jerusalem, he's also looking at how he feels about this. What else does the text say after that question? Okay, you have the word sorrow there? Yeah, New American Standard has the word pain, but if you have a footnote, the word should be sorrow there. You have suffering? Okay. Yeah. So what's he saying? Right. So it's the idea of nobody hurts like I'm hurting right now. And where does this pain come from, according to the text? The Lord inflicted it. Why? His anger. Who is God angry with? The inhabitants, with his people that live there in Jerusalem. So he's appealing to people to look and see if they can find pain like the one he's experienced as a result of what God had tormented Jerusalem with on that day of his fierce anger. So with that in mind, something else we should understand here is that the phrase, the day of his fierce anger, it's a phrase that refers to that time that God demonstrated his anger. He demonstrated his wrath toward Jerusalem through what happened with the Babylonians coming in and destroying it. But Jeremiah, that caused for himself this pain. Now, I don't think any of us here grew up in Salt Lake. I think that's a safe assumption. But imagine if you did. And Salt Lake was your home. And you saw it completely destroyed. That would hurt. Apply it to your own hometown, wherever you grew up. And you saw it completely destroyed. That would hurt. Because it's what you knew. And you might say what Jeremiah is saying. There's no pain like mine. My home has been destroyed. So since that's true, what Jeremiah says here is similar to what Job said. In Job 19, verses 21 and 22, there the text says, pity me, O you my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does and are not satisfied with my flesh? He's saying that to his friends who are trying to help him. But that's the pain Jeremiah is feeling over the destruction of Jerusalem. That Job kind of pain. When Job lost everything. Questions or comments on verse 12? Right. Right. No, it was not. It's very difficult. So, anything else on verse 12 of chapter 1? Okay. Right. Exactly. And that's an important point. Yeah, go ahead. Right. Yeah, and that's an important point to remember. There were exceptions to this faithlessness that we see in God's people. One great example that I think of from the Old Testament is Elijah. Elijah tells God, I'm all alone. I'm the only one who's faithful, God. But God says to him, there's so many thousand that have not bowed their knee to Baal. I don't remember the exact number. I just know it. Yeah. So, yeah. And that's over in 1 Kings, I believe, 17. So I only know that's one of my favorite stories. So anything else on verse 12? All right. So we're asking, what is Lamentations about? Part of what it's about is that's Jeremiah's personal pain over Jerusalem. In this verse, Jeremiah has shown that he's experiencing personal and severe pain over what's happened to Jerusalem. It's a direct result of what God had brought on Jerusalem on this day of his fierce anger. So since that's the case, here Jeremiah is also writing to call his readers to have some degree of sympathy over what's happened over him. In the same way that Job wanted some sympathy over the pain he was experiencing. So this brings us to the last point we're going to look at today from the text, and we're going to jump down to verse 1 of chapter 2. And look at the point that Lamentations is about the Lord's anger with Jerusalem. Somebody wouldn't mind reading that.
How the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with the clouds of his anger. He has hurled down the splendor of Israel to heaven and earth. He has not remembered your footstool in the day of your peace.
Thanks, Dad. So again, we're looking at the point that Lamentations is about the Lord's anger with Jerusalem, and we see that here in verse 1 of chapter 2. What has God done? Say that again, Dean? Okay, but what's the text say? And what do we think of when we think of a cloud? What does a cloud do? Rains?
No, it blocks the sun too.
Blocks the sun.
Actually, a big thing.
Okay. All right. Yeah, but a cloud, it covers. So this verse is using that imagery for God's anger. But it calls Jerusalem the daughter of Zion. Now, one reason for that is because Zion is the place where Jerusalem is located. We sometimes hear Mount Zion. So Jerusalem is pictured as Zion's daughter, but the point here is that God's wrath, his anger, has covered it. In the same way that a cloud might cover cities, such as Jerusalem, in preparation for a storm. So having made this point, in the next two lines of this verse, Jeremiah makes another statement about what God has done. What else has he done according to this verse? What does the text say? And you have the word splendor there? Yeah. You don't have the word splendor in yours? Or glory? The beauty of Israel. Okay. So yes, the New American Standard has the word glory. You might find the word splendor, but the idea is honor. But the picture being drawn here is that Israel had a place in heaven, but now God has cast it out down to the earth. Again, this is imagery that's being used. So Israel lost its position with God. It's being pictured here as having been up there in heaven with God, but now they've done what they've done. They're gone from heaven. That God threw them out. And part of that is because of his anger, the first part of the verse. So as a result, in the last two lines of this verse, Jeremiah goes on to say, I'll just read again, that God has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. Now, what do we think of when we think of a footstool? and then put your feet on. Now, sometimes it's used in a slavery context, but part of the picture here is that Jerusalem was a place where God put his feet. It's still that position that Jerusalem had with God. But he's forgotten about them. It's a relaxing pose. Yeah, that's a good point to remember here. But he got angry with them. He wanted nothing to do with them anymore. And we see that because we find that phrase again, the day of his anger. Now, the other verse said the day of his fierce anger, but the point is still the same. Questions or comments on this verse? Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, they hadn't come to realize it yet. Wouldn't come till later that they'd come back to God. So, anything else on verse 1 of chapter 2? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And this is just one of many examples. So, anything else on verse 1 of chapter 2? Okay. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 1 of chapter 2, we're asking the question, what is Lamentations about? It's a book about God's anger with Jerusalem. In this verse of chapter 2, Jeremiah has shown that, among other things, God was angry with Jerusalem. If we were to jump back to verse 22 of chapter 1, the verse before this one, text says, "Let all their wickedness come before you, and deal with them as you have dealt with me. For all my transgressions, for my groans are many, and my heart is faint." So part of that picture is their wickedness is come before God, and God is angry. Now, another reason we know God's anger is a major theme of this book is because all of chapter 2 is all about how angry God is with Jerusalem. If you read through this chapter, it's all about God's anger. So, wrapping all these things up, the point we should be left with from what we've studied today is that Lamentations is a book about Jerusalem. It's about the fall of Jerusalem. It's about Jeremiah's pain over Jerusalem. It's about God's anger with Jerusalem. So Lamentations is a book that deserves our study. And it deserves our study because it gives us more insight into how God deals with his people when they're unfaithful. It's a book that gives us insight into how we should respond to some of God's dealings with his people. And since that's true, we have to take time to look into this short but great book in order to better know how we ought to conduct ourselves as the people of God, as we look at how God deals with his people both in good times and in bad. Again, those are just some applications from what we've studied today. Anything else? No. All right. Matt, will you close?